According to the subtitle on his book, Greg is supposed to be writing about how Christians can share their faith. But as we're going to see yet again today, what he's mostly concerned about is how to avoid being held accountable for his own bigoted and intolerant views. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And today we's up to Chapter 13, entitled Taking the Roof Off, which may seem like a kind of peculiar title, especially considering that what the chapter's actually about is trying to disprove somebody's objection by showing that it leads to an absurd conclusion. He starts off with a long discussion about how you's out on the road and you's following a map and the map ain't taking you where you want to go, and that's how you know that you got a bad map. And supposedly, this helps explain how you can refute somebody's objections by showing they lead to bogus conclusions, as if that needed explaining somehow. And he calls this tactic taking the roof off. Greg says he got this oddly named tactic from reading the writings of Christian philosopher Francis Schaeffer. Quote, "When I was a young Christian, I read Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Is There. Schaeffer argued that Christians have a powerful ally in the war of ideas, reality. Whenever someone tries to deny the truth, reality ultimately betrays him." End quote. Which, from my perspective as an ex-Christian, is a pretty ironic thing to say. I tried for years to deny that Christianity is a myth, but reality ultimately betrayed me and my Christian faith, as it has done with so many other believers. Fortunately, I learned my lesson, and now I make it my goal to always ensure that my beliefs is based on whatever's most consistent with objective reality. And that's working out nicely. But back to Greg and Francis Schaeffer. Greg explains that this is where he gets this taking the roof off stuff. Quote, "Any person who denies the truth of God's world lives in a contradiction. On the outside he claims one thing, yet deep inside he believes something else because he cannot escape the truth that God has imprinted on his soul." Romans 1:19. End quote. And Romans 1, of course, is the passage that says God has revealed himself to everybody just by creation, which apologists likes to use to claim that everybody already knows that God is real. Which is fine and all, except that none of that is actually true. It's just plain old naive superstition, giving God credit for stuff folks just don't understand. But Greg thinks it's all true, and that means he thinks he's got an ace up his sleeve when it comes to truth claims, because he knows there's secretly a conflict in the non-believer's heart between what they believes and what they actually know. Quote, "To protect himself from considering the consequences of this conflict, he subconsciously erects a defense, a deceptive cover, a roof. He's in denial. Our job is to remove that roof, expose the fraud, and deprive him of his false sense of security." End quote. Ain't that brilliant? What better way to deny your own cognitive dissonance than to assume the other feller's the one in denial and that they need your help to get their roof off? So Greg has taken his stand firmly on nothing, and he thinks that's going to put him in a good position to take the roof off other folks. Not too surprisingly, it ain't going to go well. Remember, this roof is supposed to be there to protect folks from having to admit that God is real. And Greg's first example is Mother Teresa. Quote, "Mother Teresa once appealed to the governor of California to stay the execution of a vicious double murderer. She reasoned that since Jesus would forgive, the governor should forgive." End quote. And Greg objects to that on the grounds that if you apply that reasoning consistently, you're going to end up letting everybody out of prison, which he thinks would be both ridiculous and dangerous. But that's where he stops. He don't say, if it's a bad idea to forgive folks, why did Jesus do it? If it'd be bad to forgive everybody, why forgive anybody? Remember, according to evangelical Christians, we's all such horrible, evil, awful sinners that we actually deserve to be tortured for all eternity. That's how unforgivably bad each of us is supposed to be. I mean, double murder is bad, but it ain't eternal torment in the flames of hell bad. And yet, each of us is supposedly worse. But to hear evangelical Christians tell it, it's fine when God forgives believers, and it's also fine when he refuses to forgive everybody else, including a certain number of folks like Mother Teresa, who thinks they's Christians, but who Greg thinks ain't. So forgiveness is both good and bad, both the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. By Greg's reasoning, he ought to reject the doctrine of divine forgiveness as being absurd and self-contradictory. But he just puts a roof over it and moves on. Greg's next example is even worse. Quote, typically, social conservatives in this country have opposed granting marriage licenses to same-sex partners. A common response to that opposition is, that's the same thing people said about interracial marriage. The assumption is that since people were wrong to oppose interracial marriage, they must be wrong to oppose same-sex marriage. End quote. And notice what Greg ain't saying here. When folks say that's the same thing people said about interracial marriage, it's because the opponents of gay marriage was claiming that it was against the Bible. But Greg don't want to remind folks about the similar role that the Bible played in the debate over interracial marriage, so he don't say nothing about what folks is saying now that's the same as they were saying back then, which seems like kind of a telling omission, if you ask me. Anyways, Greg wants to claim that it's ridiculous to compare Bible-based bigotry in the 50s and 60s to modern Bible-based bigotry, so here's the argument he come up with. Quote, so you think the government should approve of homosexual unions? Of course. But people said the government should approve of slavery too. They were wrong then, and you are wrong now. Same-sex marriage is wrong. End quote. I can kind of see what he's trying to do here. I mean, he's trying to say that if we can compare the opponents of gay marriage to the opponents of interracial marriage, then he can compare the supporters of same-sex marriage to the supporters of slavery on the grounds that, he thinks slavery and same-sex marriages is both wrong or something. His argument is hopelessly befuddled, and he closes this section with a statement that's a little bit revealing as to where his confusion is coming from. Quote, the only way out of this problem is to show a similarity between interracial marriage and same-sex marriage that is relevant to the issue of government endorsement. There is none. End quote. And that's horse apples, of course. He's got his blinders screwed on so tight he can't even see what's right in front of his own nose. I reckon this must be another one of them roofs he was talking about before. First of all, same-sex marriage and interracial marriage has in common the fact that they's both marriage. That is, there's a long-term commitment between two consenting adults, same as heterosexual marriage. Both has been challenged on biblical grounds, and both has been the target of much bigoted slander that never once has shown any actual harm or any compelling reason why the government ought to intervene to prevent it. Both is questions pertaining to individual liberty in a free society, which the government has a duty to protect equally for all individuals within society. Both seek only the same benefits as heterosexual same-race couples enjoys, and both makes a positive contribution to society by encouraging much-needed diversity in an ideologically inbred world. What about Greg's attempts to use slavery to draw parallels with gay marriage? Well, that kind of backfires since supporters of slavery have far more in common with the opponents of gay marriage and interracial marriage than they do with gay rights advocates. In particular, they all appeal to the Bible to support their claim that the government should endorse slavery and reject same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. This is an impressively bad argument, and I say that as someone who has reviewed both Frank Turek and Ray Comfort. If and he'd set out explicitly to make himself look as intolerant and ignorant as possible, he could hardly have done more. And yet, he thinks that by making this misshapen and misbegotten argument, he has pulled the roof off the rest of us and deprived us of some kind of false sense of security? Great googly moogly. Greg continues his crusade against human rights by recycling a straw man from the previous chapter. Quote, it's been common to justify one's sexual orientation by an appeal to nature. Some people think the claim, "I was born this way," is all that's needed to stem moral criticism of their behavior. I once asked a radio caller who used this reasoning regarding homosexuality if the same rationale would justify gay bashing. End quote. No, of course it wouldn't, because unlike homosexuality, homophobic hate and persecution inflict unjustified suffering and harm on innocent folks. See, it ain't just a question of whether or not something's natural. The more important question is whether it promotes happiness and well-being or whether it promotes suffering and harm. Homosexuality is a harmless variation in biological human sexuality, just as it is in many other species. It promotes committed, long-term, mutually supportive relationships in a way that strengthens society just like heterosexual attraction does. Gay folks happens to fall in love differently than hetero folks do, but this in no way justifies denying them equal protection of their fundamental human rights, including the right to marry. As Greg himself says, quote, "The difference between just doing what comes naturally and principled self-restraint is called civilization. Morality that counters one's natural inclinations rather than approves of them is our only refuge from a life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." End quote. And that's exactly right, except that Greg is trying to claim that this is a reason why gay folks ought to be denied equal protection under the law, instead of acknowledging that it's the homophobes who are required by the principles of civilization to restrain their hateful impulses and treat gay folks with the same tolerance and respect they demand for themselves. And of course, no crusade against human rights would be complete without inventing a pretext for forced pregnancy. Quote, "When someone justifies abortion by saying women have the right to choose, use a version of taking off the roof called trotting out the toddler. Ask if a woman should have the same right to kill her 1-year-old child for the same reason." End quote. And notice the truncated version of the argument in favor of choice that he's using here. The full argument is that a woman, or really any person, has the final jurisdiction over what is or is not allowed inside their own skin. The government can't force you to donate a kidney, even to save someone else's life. And that's the principle that applies here. Obviously, a 1-year-old toddler ain't inside the woman's skin, so no, of course, a person's right to bodily autonomy don't justify killing a 1-year-old. Greg is setting up a false analogy here, as well as omitting some key points of information, such as the fact that a fertilized egg cell ain't a person in any reasonable sense of the word. Gestation is a process, and the end result of that process is a full-term, fully formed baby. But that don't mean that interrupting the process is the same as murdering a 1-year-old. And of course, the big point that Greg is leaving out is the fact that forced pregnancy is a form of sexual assault. It's the use of violence or the threat of violence to coercively use someone else's genitals in a way that degrades them and may even endanger them. That is a sexual assault. Now, you may decide to hold the unscientific opinion that a developing organism is a fully formed person right from the moment of conception, but your opinion don't give you the right to sexually assault women. If you want to oppose abortion, your only ethical option is to prevent unwanted pregnancies through comprehensive sex education and freely available contraception. But pro-lifers don't want that, because the whole point of forced pregnancy is to degrade and debase women and turn them back into sex objects for men. The blood libel about baby killing is just a pretext for the sexual assaults. And at this point, I feel like I need to remind folks that this chapter is supposed to be about confronting non-believers with the alleged reality of God's existence. I mean, that may not be obvious, considering that Greg's examples has all been focused on deflecting criticism of his own bigotry and intolerance. And his next example is more of the same. Quote, "If moralizing causes hate and hate leads to violence, are those who demonize Christians for condemning homosexuality also guilty of hate-mongering? It simply does not follow that moral condemnation of homosexuality encourages gay bashing any more than moral condemnation of bigoted Christians encourages violence against believers." End quote. So first of all, no, it ain't demonizing to say that folks is doing what those folks themselves say they's doing. Conservative Christians is accused of preaching that homosexuality is a dangerous perversion that corrupts young people and destroys families. Do they deny that this is what they believe and teach? No, they're proud of it. They think they're serving God that way. Now, it so happens that this is a bigoted slander against gays, and believers gets really resentful whenever anybody tries to hold them accountable for what they're saying, and that's when they turn on the gaslights just like Greg is doing here. Who is it that's actually getting beat up and shot and bombed by folks who believes the hateful rhetoric? It ain't the Christians, folks. It's the gays who are being accused of literal demonic influence who's being assaulted and killed. Greg's cranking the gaslighting up to 11, but his kind of hateful rhetoric is spawning violence, and holding Christians accountable for their bigotry ain't. Next up, Greg switches from taking the roof off to nailing it back on again. Quote, some people think that facts and knowledge undermine true faith. The reasoning goes like this. Faith is believing things we cannot know. Faith and knowledge, then, are at opposite ends of the spectrum. The more facts we have, the less room there is for faith. God is most pleased when we cling faithfully to our convictions in spite of overwhelming evidence against them. End quote. And that's a pretty good summary of how Christian faith actually works, with one additional caveat, and that is that God does not show up objectively in the real world, which means we ain't got any opportunity to put our faith in Him per se. In His objective absence, our only option is to put our faith in the things that ordinary human folks says about God. And that ain't faith in God, that's faith in ordinary human folks, who has an unfortunate tendency to be unreliable in certain circumstances. Now, believing what folks tells you, despite the facts, just because they says so, is simple gullibility. And the fact that Christianity makes a virtue out of believing what you's told is kind of too obviously creating a situation that's ideal for spreading false information. So Greg has to put a roof over this aspect of Christianity to shield it from close examination. Quote, if this is your view of faith, following this route will lead you into a spiritual ditch. First, apologetics, giving evidence in defense of the truth, would be misguided. End quote. And this is a little lie that Greg tells himself to give himself a false sense of security. Apologetics ain't facts being offered in support of the truth. Apologetics is arguments that believers puts their faith in as if they was facts, so as to shield themselves from the inconsistencies between what they believe and what we actually observe in the real world. It's what Francis Schaeffer called a roof, and that's a problem for Greg. Quote, what has gone wrong here? The problem is with the premise, faith is believing things we cannot know. This is not a biblical understanding of faith. End quote. And this is the part where Greg conspicuously fails to quote Hebrews 11:1, which says, quote, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. End quote. According to Greg, the definition of faith that's written in the Bible ain't the biblical understanding of faith, because the definition that's written in the Bible is uncomfortably close to admitting that Christians is believing things despite the facts. Quote, faith and knowledge are not opposites in Scripture. They are companions. The opposite of faith is not fact, but unbelief. The opposite of knowledge is not faith, but ignorance. Neither unbelief nor ignorance is a virtue in Christianity. End quote. Now, technically, the opposite of faith is skepticism. Faith is believing what you've been told just because you've been told, no matter what the facts say. Skepticism is believing only what you can test against objective reality and find to be verifiably true. And that's the opposite of faith. And it's also the opposite of gullibility, which is something that Greg ought to spend more time thinking about. As for ignorance not being a virtue in Christianity, well, let's just take a look at what Greg has to say about Earth Day. Quote, has anyone else noticed a contradiction implicit in the annual Earth Day celebrations? The vast majority of devotees at such feats are Darwinists who believe humans have an obligation to protect the environment. Starting with a naturalistic worldview, though, why should anyone care? End quote. Notice the appeal to ignorance here. Greg does not know why someone with a naturalistic worldview would want to protect their own environment, and he uses his own ignorance as if it was an apologetic argument against evolution. But if ignorance ain't a virtue in Christianity, then why is Greg appealing to it as a defense of Christianity? And look at how he applies his ignorance to the celebration of Earth Day. Quote, "The moral motivation for Earth Day simply does not follow from Darwinism. It makes perfect sense, though, if God entrusted human beings with stewardship over the planet. Taking the roof off, following an idea to its logical conclusion, shows that Earth Day makes sense for theists, but not for Darwinists." End quote. And that's exactly backwards, which is why it was environmentalists and not theists who originally come up with Earth Day and who's the most enthusiastic about celebrating it. Environmentalists believe that we need to take care of this world because it's the only one we got, and we'll suffer for it if we let it go to crap. And Greg can't possibly be ignorant of that fact, and yet he still uses this kind of ignorance as an apologetic. Meanwhile, Christians like Greg believe that this world ain't our real home at all. There's even songs about it. Our real home is supposedly in heaven, where everything's perfect, and not down here on earth, which is tainted by sin and suffering, and which ain't going to last all that long anyways, at least not by comparison to eternity. And by the way, according to the Genesis story, God told Adam and Eve to fill the earth and subdue it. He didn't say nothing about protecting it from greedy industrialists and their toxic byproducts. And I think this is probably a good stopping point, considering Greg gives a couple more short examples of what he calls taking the roof off, but it's basically the same sort of thing he's been saying all along with the same kind of mistakes and fallacies in them. Considering how badly he screws up here, maybe he should have given this chapter the title, Taking the Speck Out, as in taking the speck out of your brother's eye while ignoring the log in your own. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to wrap it up for me for today. Next time, Greg's going to educate us about 4 reasons why people don't listen to good arguments. And considering what kind of arguments Greg thinks is good ones, that would be pretty fun. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.